There is a moment, rare, almost impossible to plan for, when the most powerful room in Britain goes completely silent. Not the silence of respect, not the silence of mourning or prayer. The kind of silence that falls when something has happened that no one in that room has a script for. When centuries of protocol, of rehearsed composure, of trained facial muscles and measured breath, all of it simply stops working. That moment happened on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday morning, inside the walls of Kensington Palace. A senior aide had walked into a private briefing room carrying a folder. Inside that folder was a report, 2 pages, single-spaced, flagged with a yellow sticky note that said, simply, "You need to see this before it goes further." The aide set it on the table, left the room, closed the door quietly, and somewhere down the corridor, before the ink of that morning had even dried on the day's schedule, Prince William began to laugh. Not a polite chuckle, not the carefully modulated smile he had trained himself to offer in public. A real laugh, the kind that starts in the chest and refuses to stop, the kind you hear through walls. The palace stared. Advisors exchanged glances. Senior staff, men and women who had navigated royal crises for decades, stood in the corridor outside that room with no idea what to do next. Because what was in that folder wasn't funny, not to them. But to William, apparently, it was the funniest thing he had heard in years. And the truth, the real truth behind why he laughed, what was in that report and what it meant for everyone in that building, is a story that starts long before that Tuesday morning. It starts the way most palace stories do, quietly behind closed doors with someone convinced they were untouchable. They were wrong. The folder had been prepared by a mid-level communications officer named Gerald Ashworth. Gerald was 43 years old, had worked in royal communications for 11 years, and was the kind of man who kept meticulous records of everything. Meeting notes, email timestamps, even handwritten logs of phone calls that most people would have considered too routine to document. It was this habit that made Gerald dangerous, not intentionally. Gerald was not a man with a plan. He was simply a man who wrote things down. For 3 years, Gerald had been aware of something that made him deeply uncomfortable. A pattern. A slow, careful campaign being run by a small group of senior palace figures to shape how certain stories were handled, specifically, stories that touched on the relationship between the Wales household and the broader institution. Stories that, in Gerald's careful log, seemed to consistently serve one agenda while quietly disadvantaging another. He had not gone looking for this pattern, it had found him. In a Tuesday afternoon briefing in 2022, he had been handed a briefing document to proofread standard practice, and had noticed that a key paragraph had been altered from the version he had seen 2 days earlier. The alteration was subtle. The meaning was not. He said nothing that afternoon. He went home, opened the notebook he kept in his desk drawer, and wrote down exactly what he had seen. Date, time, which paragraph, what it had said before, what it said now. He added a question mark at the end, as if asking himself whether he was imagining things. He was not imagining things. Over the following months, Gerald documented 17 separate instances of what he came to think of carefully, privately, only in his own notebook, as managed distortion, not outright lies. Nothing so clean. It was subtler than that. It was the strategic omission of context, the careful framing of events to lead journalists, and by extension the public, toward conclusions that served certain interests inside the palace over others. The specific interests being served, Gerald eventually concluded, were those of a small cluster of senior advisors who had aligned themselves strongly with a particular vision of the monarchy's future. A vision that did not include William being perceived as the independent, reform-minded future king he was increasingly becoming. Gerald was not political. He had no horse in this race. He simply had a notebook and an increasingly uneasy conscience. In early 2024, something changed. A story broke in 3 tabloids simultaneously, the kind of coordinated timing that only happens when someone has deliberately fed the same information to multiple outlets at once. The story concerned a private disagreement between William and a senior palace figure over a charitable initiative. The details were accurate enough to be credible, but framed in a way that made William appear difficult, entitled, resistant to guidance. The story was, in Gerald's assessment, a hit piece, and he knew from his records exactly where it had come from. He thought about it for 6 weeks. He prayed about it. He later told the one colleague he eventually trusted. He wrote several drafts of a letter he never sent. He walked past closed office doors and wondered what would happen to him if he spoke. Then one morning he came in early before anyone else arrived and typed up a clean summary document. 2 pages, single-spaced. He printed 2 copies. He put one in a sealed envelope in the back of his desk drawer. The other he placed in a manila folder with a yellow sticky note on top. He left it on the table in the private briefing room that William used on Tuesday mornings. Then he went to the bathroom, splashed cold water on his face, looked at himself in the mirror for a long moment, and went back to his desk to wait. William arrived at 8:47 a.m. He was carrying a coffee in one hand and his phone in the other, already mid-conversation with his private secretary about a scheduling conflict later that week. He walked into the briefing room out of habit, set his coffee down, glanced at the folder on the table, picked it up without thinking, and began reading while still half listening to the phone call. His private secretary, James Hartley, noticed the shift about 40 seconds in. William had gone quiet on the phone, not the focused quiet of someone concentrating on what they're being told. The different quiet of someone who has stopped hearing you at all because something in front of them has taken every available bit of their attention. "Sir," James said. William held up one finger. The phone call ended. He read the 2 pages. Then he went back and read the first page again. He set the folder down, picked up his coffee, took a slow sip, and looked out the window at the gray morning sky over the palace gardens. Then he laughed. It started quietly, almost a breath. Then it built, and once it built, it didn't stop. It was the laugh of a man who has just been handed definitive proof of something he has suspected for so long that the confirmation feels less like a shock and more like a long-awaited arrival. Relief dressed up as laughter. The release of years of tension through the only valve that happened to be open at that moment. James stood in the doorway, completely uncertain what to do. "Sir, is everything?" "Read it," William said, still laughing, and pushed the folder across the table. James read it. His expression moved through several stages: confusion, comprehension, alarm, and landed somewhere that was not laughter at all. "This is," James began. "I know," William said. He was calming down now, running a hand across his face, getting himself back. "I know exactly what it is." What it was confirmation. Documented confirmation with dates and specific instances of exactly the pattern William had suspected was being run against him for years. He had sensed it. He had raised it carefully in conversations with trusted people. He had been told, in the gentle language that senior palace figures use when they want to make someone feel managed rather than dismissed, that he was perhaps overthinking it, that the press had its own dynamics. That the institution, naturally, had to balance many interests. He had gone home from those conversations and said nothing to anyone, and the suspicion had continued to sit in him like a stone. And now Gerald Ashworth's notebook had turned it into evidence. The laughter had not been at the situation. It had not been at Gerald. It had been at the specific, exquisite irony that the very people who had spent 3 years carefully constructing a narrative of William as someone who needed to be managed had been brought down. Not by a rival faction, not by a journalist, not by any of the things palaces guard against, but by a mid-level communications officer who simply wrote things down. The next 4 hours were among the quietest William had experienced inside the palace in years. He asked James to locate Gerald Ashworth and bring him to a separate room, not his office, somewhere less formal, without alerting anyone else. He asked for his personal solicitor to be contacted privately. He made one phone call to someone whose name James did not write down that lasted 11 minutes. Then he sat with the folder in front of him and thought. William was not, by nature, an impulsive man. He had spent his entire life learning not to be. He had watched what impulsiveness cost, in his family, in the institution, in the public's perception of royals who acted on feeling before considering consequence. He understood the architecture of patience better than almost anyone in his position ever had to, because he had been given an unusually prolonged education in it. But patience and inaction are different things. He knew that too. When Gerald was brought to him, the young man, because up close, Gerald seemed younger than his 43 years, nervous in the particular way of someone who has done something brave and is no longer certain they were wise to do it, sat across from William with his hands folded on the table. You left this for me, William said. It was not a question. Gerald nodded. Why? Gerald was quiet for a moment. Then he said, because it was the right thing to do, sir, and because someone needed to. William looked at him for a long time. Are you afraid right now? Very much so, sir. That's honest, William said. I appreciate that. He paused. Are the records you kept still intact? Yes, sir. The originals are at home, not on any palace system. William nodded slowly. Good. You did the right thing, Mr. Ashworth. I want you to know that clearly, whatever happens next. What happened next would take weeks to fully unfold. The names in Gerald's report were names that could not simply be acted upon in a Tuesday morning. They required careful handling, legal counsel, conversations at levels that William could not initiate alone. There were institutional considerations, communications implications, questions about what could be proven versus what was documented versus what was known. But the thing about evidence, real evidence, dated and specific, is that it changes the weight of a room. Everyone who knew the folder existed, who knew what was in it, who understood what a thorough solicitor would make of Gerald Ashworth's 11-year habit of writing things down. Every one of those people entered the following days carrying a different kind of knowledge. The palace did not implode. Institutions rarely do, not from a single document, not even a damning one. What changed was subtler and in the long run more significant. The specific advisors named in Gerald's report began, one by one, to find their access quietly reduced. Meetings they had previously been included in stopped appearing on their calendars. Briefings that had once come to them directly were rerouted. No accusations were made publicly. No dramatic confrontations took place in corridors. The palace does not work that way, and William understood the palace too well to want it to. But the people who needed to understand what had happened understood. 3 weeks after that Tuesday morning, a brief internal restructuring of the Royal Communications Division was announced. It was attributed, in the dry language of institutional notices, to an ongoing review of operational efficiency. No names were mentioned. No reason was given. Gerald Ashworth was transferred to a newly created role in the palace's historical archives, a position that had not existed before and which, if you looked at it from a certain angle, bore a striking resemblance to somewhere quiet and respected where a man with a habit of documentation might be both useful and, for the time being, safely out of the daily flow of palace politics. Whether Gerald saw it that way is something only he knows. He did not speak publicly. He never has. There is no record of him discussing what happened with anyone outside the room. But in the weeks that followed, people who worked in and around the palace noticed something that they could not quite explain, and none of them put in writing. The atmosphere in William's wing of the building had changed. Something that had felt for years like low-level static, a persistent, almost imperceptible tension had eased. He walked differently. He laughed more in general, not just that once in the briefing room with the folder open in front of him. He moved through the building with a quality that the people who watched him closely recognized as something that had been missing for longer than any of them had realized. Ease, simple, uncomplicated ease. The palace, for its part, continued as palaces do. The flags were changed on schedule. The briefings continued. The statements were issued and the engagements were attended, and the careful, centuries-old machinery of British royal life turned forward as it always has. But something had shifted in the room where it all began. Something true had found its way into the light, not loudly, not in headlines, not in any of the ways that truth usually travels when it involves powerful institutions and the people inside them. Quietly, carried in a manila folder, brought by a man who simply wrote things down. And William, future king, son of a complicated dynasty, husband, father, man, had read 2 single-spaced pages on a gray Tuesday morning and laughed until the walls could hear him. Because sometimes the truth doesn't arrive like a thunderclap. Sometimes it arrives like the end of a very long wait. And sometimes, when you have been patient long enough, when you have carried something for years without letting it show, when the world finally hands you the piece you have been missing. Laughter is the only honest response.